I'm Cameron, 35 male. I live in a small apartment in Austin, Texas, where the silence is now only broken by the sounds of my two children. My life revolves around my 6-year-old daughter Ella and my 8-month-old son Luke. After losing my wife, I made a decision out of pure desperation, entrusting my children to the last people I ever thought I'd need, only to discover that the quiet home I remembered was hiding a monstrous secret that had been waiting for a new generation. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. 8 months ago, my world didn't just crack. It shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. My wife Vivian was the vibrant, beating heart of our family, an elementary school teacher whose laughter could fill every corner of our tiny apartment. She was taken from us in a brutal, senseless car accident involving a truck that lost control on the highway. One moment she was here, planning a weekend trip to the park, and the next she was gone. The silence she left behind was deafening, a heavy blanket that smothered everything. It was replaced by the relentless, sharp cries of our infant son, Luke, and the profound, unnerving quiet of our daughter, Ella. I work as a graphic designer for a major advertising agency, a job that was once my passion but has since become a grueling necessity. The late nights I used to spend joyfully sketching storyboards and fine-tuning color palettes now felt like a desperate race against time and exhaustion. Every freelance project I took on was another hour stolen from my sleep, another step toward a dream that now felt impossibly distant. A house with a green yard where my kids could play, a life Vivian would have wanted for them. Life became a brutal, repeating cycle. During the day, I was a machine of productivity, fueled by caffeine and the sheer will to keep our finances afloat. At night, I was a father walking the tightrope of grief and parental duty. Luke, born premature, was a fragile baby who needed constant attention. His cries were a soundtrack to my sleepless nights, each one a piercing reminder of my inadequacy. I wasn't Vivian. I didn't have her magic touch, her ability to soothe him with a soft lullaby or a gentle hum. Some nights as I held him, my own exhaustion felt like a physical weight, so heavy that I feared it was changing me. There was one terrifying moment when his crying wouldn't stop, and I felt my hand clench around his tiny ankle, a surge of frustration so potent it shocked me. I let go instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs, horrified at the stranger I was becoming. Ella, my bright, sensitive 6-year-old, retreated into a world of her own. She'd sit for hours in a corner with her sketchbook, drawing the same picture over and over, a family of 4 under a smiling sun, a life that was now just a memory on paper. Her silence was almost worse than Luke's crying. It was a constant, quiet accusation that I couldn't fix what was broken. The breaking point came when my unreliable babysitter quit for good. She cited my unstable schedule, leaving me stranded. I was in the middle of a major project at work and quitting wasn't an option. The bills were piling up and my children depended on me. I felt trapped, backed into a corner with no escape. After days of wrestling with my pride and a deep-seated, nameless unease, I made the call I'd been avoiding. I called my parents. Thomas and Carol Doyle lived in a quiet suburb about 30 minutes away. My father, a 62-year-old retired military officer, was a man carved from stone, strict, disciplined, and emotionally distant. My mother, 58, a retired preschool teacher, presented a softer image, always calm and composed. Our relationship had always been formal, a collection of polite holiday visits and birthdays acknowledged with a card. I told myself this arrangement would be temporary, a short-term solution to an impossible problem. They were family, after all. Surely they would keep my children safe. I didn't know that in making that call, I was willingly walking my children into the very past I had spent my entire life subconsciously running from. At first, the arrangement felt like a godsend. A wave of relief washed over me, so profound it almost felt like peace. My new routine was punishing but manageable. Every morning, I'd drop Luke off at their house with a meticulously packed bag of formula, diapers, and toys. Then I'd take Ella to school before racing to the office to lose myself in a sea of deadlines. In the afternoons, my parents would pick Ella up, and the kids would stay with them until I could break away from work, usually around 10 p.m. Their home was exactly as I remembered it, a monument to order and control. The lawns were perfectly manicured, the furniture gleamed without a speck of dust, and the picture frames on the wall hung in perfect, rigid alignment. It was less of a home and more of a museum, cold and sterile. Carol played her part perfectly. She prepared healthy meals, cut Ella's sandwiches into neat triangles, and read stories to her from colorful picture books. She assured me Luke was gaining weight and that Ella was adjusting beautifully. "She's such a calm, well-behaved child," my mother would say with a gentle smile. "She never causes any trouble." Thomas remained a stoic presence in the background. He'd be in his study with the newspaper or outside trimming the hedges with military precision. His interactions with me were limited to a curt nod or a brief perfunctory question about my job. I was grateful for the stability they provided. The neighbors adored them. The Doyles are pillars of the community, an elderly woman told me one evening as I arrived. So kind, so respectable. I clung to these words, using them to build a wall against the flicker of unease that sometimes pricked at my conscience. But the unease was persistent. It was in the way Luke would jolt awake and scream at the sound of a door slamming. I dismissed it as a sensitivity from his premature birth. It was in the way Ella grew progressively quieter, her vibrant drawings losing their color. She would often just sit in a corner of their living room, sketching, her shoulders hunched. I accepted my mother's explanation that she was simply a good girl adjusting to a new, disciplined environment. I needed to believe it. I was so desperate for a lifeline that I was willing to ignore the signs that the water I was treading was far more dangerous than I could imagine. The peace I felt was an illusion, a fragile veneer stretched thin over a rot I couldn't yet see, but could feel in the deepest parts of my soul. For the first month, I allowed myself to live in that illusion. The crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest since Vivian's death began to lift just slightly. I could focus at work, meet my deadlines, and even manage a genuine smile during my brief evening drives home with Ella. She would sit in the back seat, recounting small details from her day, a new friend, a funny story, a lost crayon. These small moments of normalcy were my anchor, and I held onto them tightly, convincing myself that I had finally found a sustainable solution. But soon tiny hairline cracks started to appear in the perfect facade my parents had constructed. They were small things, easily dismissed if you weren't looking for them, but they collected in the back of my mind, creating a persistent, low-level hum of anxiety. Ella's smiles became rarer. I noticed she would physically flinch whenever my father, Thomas, entered a room. Her posture would change instantly. Her small shoulders would curve inward, her eyes would fix on her sketchbook, and her hand would grip her pencil with white-knuckled intensity. She was building a fortress of paper and wax around herself, and I didn't understand why. Luke, despite gaining weight, as my mother proudly reported, was not a happy baby. His sleep was restless, shattered by sudden, terrified screams. Any sharp noise, a dropped glass, a chair scraping against the floor, my father's heavy footsteps on the hardwood, would send him into a fit of inconsolable crying. I tried to reason it away, telling myself that some babies were just more sensitive than others. But a father's instinct is a powerful thing, and mine was screaming that something was wrong. The feeling intensified one evening when I managed to leave work early. Arriving at my parents' house around 9 p.m., the house was unusually dark and silent. As I pushed open the unlocked front door, I heard the sound of hurried footsteps receding down the hallway. A moment later, my mother appeared, her hair slightly messy but her smile as placid as ever. "The children went to bed early tonight, Cameron," she said softly. "They were just exhausted after a long day." I scanned the dimly lit living room. Everything looked pristine and orderly as always. But the silence felt heavy, oppressive. I picked up a sleeping Luke from his crib, and as I carried Ella, who was dozing on the sofa, to the car, I felt a tension in her small body. She didn't say a word on the drive home, just stared out the window, a silent little shadow in the back seat. That night after I put them to bed, sleep wouldn't come. I sat in the dark, the ticking of the clock echoing the frantic rhythm of my thoughts. The image of the dark house, the hurried footsteps, Ella's silent retreat, it all felt wrong. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the accumulated stress and grief were making me see ghosts where there were none. I had to trust them. I had no other choice. But the evidence kept mounting, piece by unsettling piece. During our nightly video calls, Ella's answers became clipped and monosyllabic. I could see her eyes darting nervously to someone off screen. My mother would often cut the calls short, using the excuse that the kids needed their rest. The most alarming discovery came one evening as I was changing Luke's diaper. I noticed a cluster of small, faint bruises on his upper arm, shaped almost like fingerprints. My blood ran cold. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked my mother about them. "Oh, that's nothing," she said with an airy wave of her hand, not even looking up from the magazine she was reading. "He's probably just bumping into things now that he's trying to crawl. You know how clumsy babies can be." Thomas sat in his armchair across the room, silent and unmoving, his gaze as cold and hard as granite. I nodded, but her casual dismissal felt like a lie. The final undeniable warning came not from my children, but from Ella's teacher. I received a text message one afternoon that made my world stop spinning. It read, "Mr. Doyle, Ella had a breakdown in class today. She was crying and said she doesn't want to go to her grandparents' house anymore." I stared at the screen, the words blurring together. Ella loved school. She adored her teacher. For her to break down like that, to say those words, meant her fear had become too great to contain. That night, as I looked at the photograph of Vivian on my nightstand, her smiling face felt like a judgment. I had failed them. I had seen the signs, Ella's silence, Luke's bruises, my own gnawing intuition, and I had chosen to ignore them because it was easier. The conversation I'd had with Ella a few weeks prior came rushing back to me. I had sat with her on the sofa, gently asking if something was wrong. Her voice, small and trembling, had delivered a chilling accusation. Grandpa yelled at Luke when he was crying. Grandma squeezed my arm really hard and said if I didn't stop, she'd lock me in the dark room. At the time, I had hugged her and whispered reassurances, but a part of me had dismissed it. I told myself she was a grieving, imaginative child. My parents, strict as they were, couldn't be capable of such things. Now her teacher's message echoed her words, giving them a terrifying weight. I had been so desperate for a solution to my own problems that I had become deaf to my daughter's cries for help. The betrayal wasn't just my parents' actions, it was my own inaction. And as I sat there in the darkness, I knew I could no longer afford to be blind. The next morning was shrouded in a thick, oppressive dread. I went through the motions of our routine, making breakfast, packing Luke's bag, but my mind was a battlefield of guilt and fear. Ella was silent at the table, pushing her cereal around in the bowl with her spoon, her eyes downcast. The trust she had placed in me, the trust I had broken by not believing her, hung between us like a physical barrier. The drive to my parents' house was the longest 30 minutes of my life. Every hum of the engine felt like a countdown to a confrontation I wasn't ready for. When we arrived, Carol greeted me with her usual serene smile, but today it looked grotesque, a mask hiding something ugly. Thomas was at the dining table with his newspaper, a fortress of paper separating him from the world. I gave Luke to my mother, my hands hesitating for a fraction of a second. I hugged Ella tightly before leaving for her school, promising her I'd be back early to pick her up. She just nodded, her small face pale. We were almost at the school gates when it happened. Ella's voice, though quiet, was filled with a sudden, sharp urgency. Dad, I forgot my colored pencils at Grandma and Grandpa's. I sighed, my patience worn thin by a sleepless night. It's okay, sweetheart, you can borrow some from a friend for today. No, she insisted, her voice cracking. Tears welled in her eyes and she grabbed my arm, her little fingers digging into my sleeve. I need them, please, Dad, we have to go back. It wasn't the whine of a child wanting her favorite toy, it was a plea born of sheer desperation. Something in her terrified gaze told me this wasn't about pencils. My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I made a U-turn. As we neared their street, Ella's panic intensified. Dad, stop here, she whispered, pointing to the curb several houses down. Why, honey, I'll pull right into the driveways. No, please, I want to walk, she begged, her whole body trembling. Confused but unwilling to upset her further, I parked the car. We got out and her small, cold hand immediately found mine, gripping it like a lifeline. We walked down the quiet, sun-dappled sidewalk, but the cheerful suburban scenery felt sinister, like a set for a horror movie. As we got closer, Ella stopped abruptly, pulling me behind a large, overgrown hedge. She put a finger to her lips, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on the living room window of my parents' house. And then I heard it, a sound that will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. It was Luke's cry, not the fussy, tired cry of a baby, but a high-pitched, piercing shriek of pure terror. It was punctuated by a harsh, booming voice, Thomas's voice. My blood turned to ice. Crouching beside my daughter, I peered through a small gap in the curtains. The scene inside was a nightmare made real. Carol was holding Luke, but she wasn't comforting him. She was shaking him, not gently but violently, his tiny head snapping back and forth with the force of her movements. With every one of Luke's terrified wails, she shook him harder, her face a mask of cold frustration. Thomas stood over them, his face red with rage. Shut up, you little monster, be quiet, he bellowed. I saw my mother's hand tighten its grip on Luke's arm, and he screamed. A choked, agonizing sound as his face turned a terrifying shade of purple. Ella's words from weeks ago came screaming back into my head. Grandpa yelled at Luke. Grandma squeezed my arm. It wasn't a child's fantasy, it was a witness statement. For a moment I was paralyzed, frozen by a horror so absolute it stole the air from my lungs. Then a white-hot rage, a primal protective fury I had never known I possessed, erupted inside me. I didn't think, I just reacted. I burst from behind the hedge, stormed to the front door, and kicked it open. It slammed against the inside wall with a deafening crash. Carol and Thomas spun around, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. Carol was still holding Luke, her arm frozen mid-shake. Cameron, what is the meaning of this? Thomas demanded, taking a step forward. I ignored him, my eyes were locked on my son. I strode across the room, wrenched Luke from my mother's grasp and pulled him tight against my chest. He was sobbing, his tiny body trembling uncontrollably. Ella ran in behind me and latched onto my leg, her face buried in my pants. "What are you doing to my children?" I snarled, my voice low and dangerous, each word dripping with venom. Carol's composure finally shattered. She stammered, her hands shaking. He just needs discipline, Cameron, you're overreacting." Discipline, the word was an obscenity. I looked at the fresh red marks on Luke's arm, at Ella's tear-streaked face, at the raw terror in both my children's eyes. This wasn't discipline. This was torture. Without another word, I turned my back on them. Holding Luke in one arm and taking Ella's hand with the other, I walked out of that house and never looked back. The slam of my car door was a final, definitive severing of a bond I now realized was never built on love, but on control and cruelty. As I drove away, I didn't feel sadness or loss. I felt nothing but the burning, righteous fury of a father who had finally woken up. I had let my children down, but I swore on my life and on Vivian's memory that I would never, ever let them be hurt again. The drive back to our apartment was a blur of silent fury and suffocating guilt. Luke's terrified sobs eventually quieted into shuddering breaths against my chest, while Ella sat in the back, clutching her sketchbook as if it were a shield. The silence in the car was thick with everything I had failed to see, everything I had refused to hear. I hadn't just been naive, I had been a willing accomplice to my children's suffering through my denial. The weight of that realization was crushing. Back in the safety of our small apartment, I settled Luke into his crib and gathered a trembling Ella into my arms. She clung to me, burying her face in my shoulder, and for the first time in months I felt her truly relax, as if she could finally let go of the terrible secret she'd been forced to carry alone. I held her until her breathing evened out, my own heart aching with a toxic mix of love and self-loathing. Once she was calm, I made the call. My hands shook as I dialed my mother's number, but my voice was ice. When she answered, her tone a pathetic attempt at normalcy, I cut her off. "Don't ever contact me or my children again," I said, the words cold and final. "You will never see them, you will never speak to them, and you will not receive another cent from me. We're done." I hung up before she could utter a single word of her poisoned defense. That night was the longest of my life. As my children slept, I was haunted. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like my father's heavy footsteps. Every shadow in the corner of the room seemed to hold his menacing presence. But this time something else surfaced alongside the fear. Faint, fragmented memories, like distorted images seen through water, began to bubble up from the depths of my subconscious. Shouting, the sharp sound of a slap, a child's cry that I dimly recognized as my own. I saw dark hallways and felt a familiar, cold dread, a fear I had carried my entire life without ever knowing its source. It was all connected. My parents' cruelty wasn't a new development, it was a pattern, and my children had been its newest victims. In a moment of desperation, I thought of my oldie. Our sister Becca, we were practically strangers, our relationship reduced to a handful of hollow holiday texts each year. She had left home the day she turned 18 and never looked back, creating a new life for herself an entire state away. I never understood why she'd been so determined to escape, but now a horrifying suspicion began to take root. I found her number and called, my voice cracking as I asked if we could meet. There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, "All right, Cameron. The cafe on Lamar, tomorrow at 10s. The next morning, after leaving the kids with a trusted neighbor, I met her. Becca sat across from me, now a woman of 39 with sharp, intelligent eyes that held a hint of a deep, old sadness. The air between us was thick with years of unspoken history. With my voice trembling, I recounted everything: Vivian's death, my desperation, the bruises on Luke, Ella's warnings, and the horrific scene I'd witnessed through the window. As I spoke, her expression remained calm, but a muscle in her jaw tightened. When I finished, she took a slow sip of her coffee and looked me straight in the eye. "None of this surprises me," she said, her voice low and steady. Her words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean it doesn't surprise you?" She sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "Cameron, you really don't remember, do you, what Dad did to you when we were kids?" My mind went blank. The fragmented memories from the night before swirled in my head, threatening to coalesce into something monstrous. Becca began to speak, and with each word she dismantled the carefully constructed reality I had lived in for 35 years. She told me about our father Thomas and his discipline. It wasn't just spanking, it was daily beatings for the smallest infractions: spilling a glass of milk, crying too loud, not finishing his dinner. Our mother Carol was his silent accomplice. She never intervened, never protected us. She simply stood by and watched, her silence a form of consent. Becca's voice shook as she recounted the worst of it. "When you were 2, she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, "he hit you so hard you fell and cut your head open. There was blood everywhere. Mom called the doctor, but she lied. She told him you fell down the stairs. I was hiding in the closet, Cameron. I saw the whole thing. I was just a little girl and I was too terrified to say anything." The dark hallways, the shouting, the inexplicable pain, it all clicked into place. These weren't nightmares, they were memories my mind had buried to protect me. I had been that terrified child. My fear of my own anger, the way my hand had clenched around Luke's ankle, it was a learned response, an echo of the violence I had endured. They have a twisted idea of parenting, Becca explained, her voice filled with a cold fury. They believe fear equals respect. It was never about love, it was about power. About the sick satisfaction they got from controlling something smaller and weaker than them. She had understood this as a child, and she had planned her escape for years. Leaving home wasn't just an act of rebellion, it was an act of survival. I left the cafe feeling hollowed out as if my entire life had been a lie. My parents hadn't just abused my children, they had repeated the exact same pattern of abuse they had inflicted on me. The realization was sickening. The bruises on Luke's arms, Carol shaking him, Thomas's roaring voice, it was a direct replay of my own forgotten childhood. Guilt and rage burned in my gut. I had been so desperate for help that I had willingly led my own children back into the monster's den. But as I drove home, another emotion began to surface through the storm of pain, a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just about protecting my children. It was about avenging the terrified little boy I had once been. My parents had created a cycle of pain, and I was going to be the one to burn it to the ground. The weeks following my conversation with Becca were a blur of hypervigilance and simmering rage. Our apartment became a sanctuary, a fortress against the outside world and the ghosts of my past. I cut off all ties with my parents, blocking their numbers and returning their letters unopened. I was a man on a mission, focused solely on creating a bubble of safety for Ella and Luke. Therapy became a crucial part of our new life. I found a wonderful psychologist, Emily, who began working with all three of us. Slowly, painstakingly, we began to heal. Ella's therapy involved art, and I watched as her drawings gradually shifted from dark, terrifying scribbles to pictures filled with bright colors and smiling faces. Luke, with the help of a specialist, began to lose his fear of sudden noises. He started to sleep through the night, and his first real smile felt like the sun breaking through the clouds after a storm. I was learning to manage my own trauma, to name the fear and anger that had been my silent companions for so long. For the first time in months, I felt a fragile sense of hope. I believed we had escaped. Then one morning, the ground fell out from under me. I was scrolling through the local news from my parents' town, a morbid habit I'd developed, when a headline seized my attention and squeezed all the air from my lungs. Doyle Family Daycare, former teacher Carol Doyle opens doors to local children. The coffee mug fell from my hand and shattered on the floor. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. A daycare in their home, the same home where my son was shaken and my daughter was terrorized. This wasn't about needing money after I cut them off. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone what this was really about. It was about control. It was about finding a new, endless supply of small, helpless children to dominate, to instill fear in, to satisfy their depraved need for power. The image of Carol shaking Luke flashed in my mind, so vivid it was like I was back at the window. I saw Ella's pleading eyes, I saw the bruises. My hands started to tremble, not with fear this time, but with a fury so potent it made me dizzy. They hadn't stopped. They had just found new victims. A frantic search online led me to their website. It was a masterpiece of deception, filled with professionally shot photos of smiling children playing in the sun-drenched yard. And there was my mother, Carol, in the center of it all, her arm around a little girl, radiating an aura of grandmotherly warmth that I now knew was a monstrous lie. In the background of one photo, standing on the porch half hidden in the shadows, was the unmistakable silhouette of my father. I slammed my laptop shut, a wave of nausea washing over me. All those innocent parents dropping their children off every morning believing they were safe, just like I had. I couldn't sleep for days. The imagined cries of those children haunted me. I knew I couldn't just move on and let this happen. My escape meant nothing if I left others to fall into the same trap. My resolve hardened into a plan. I contacted an old college friend, Jake, who was now a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer. I laid out the entire story for him over a secure line. He listened patiently, his silence more comforting than any empty words of sympathy could have been. When I finished, his advice was blunt and clear. "You need undeniable proof, Cameron," he said. "Your word against theirs, especially given your family history, won't be enough. You need video, audio, anything that shows what's happening inside that house. Get it, and we send it anonymously to Child Protective Services. They'll do the rest." He walked me through the legalities and gave me advice on discreet recording devices. For the next several weekends, I became a ghost. I'd leave Ella and Luke in the loving care of Becca, who had become our rock, and drive the long hours to my old hometown. I'd park my car at the far end of the street, a place with a clear line of sight to their house, and I would wait. With a telephoto lens, I turned my camera into a weapon. It didn't take long. One afternoon, I caught it. Through the lens, I saw Carol with a crying toddler. Instead of comforting him, her face twisted with impatience and she shook him, the same violent head-snapping motion she had used on Luke. Thomas stood nearby, watching, his arms crossed. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the camera, but I held steady, recording every sickening second. I gathered more footage over the following weeks. Thomas yanking a little girl by the arm, Carol shouting in a child's face. Each clip was a dagger in my heart, but it was also another nail in their coffin. I knew I needed more. I needed a voice from the inside. I identified one of the mothers, a young woman named Lisa who dropped her son Max off every day. Mustering all my courage, I approached her one evening after she'd left their house. I intercepted her a few blocks away and told her everything. I saw the familiar stages of disbelief, denial, and then dawning horror cross her face. Max has been different, she whispered, her voice trembling. So jumpy, and he has these bruises. I looked into her terrified eyes and saw my own reflection. I need your help, Lisa, I said, for Max and for the others. She agreed. A few days later, she gave me a small audio recorder she had hidden in Max's backpack. The files were horrific. I heard Thomas's booming shouts, the sound of things being thrown, and the terrified sobs of multiple children. One clip made my blood freeze. If you don't stop that crying right now, Thomas's voice snarled, I'm going to lock you in the dark room. The dark room, Ella's words, it was real. That was it, that was the final piece. I spent an entire night compiling everything, the videos, the audio files, time-stamped and logged, onto an encrypted USB drive. I mailed it in a plain envelope from a post office in a D.F. Farrant town, addressed to both the Waco Child Protective Services and the local police department. There was no return address, no name. My fight wasn't for recognition. It was for them, for all the children who couldn't speak for themselves. I had set the trap. Now all I could do was wait for it to spring. The weeks after I sent the package were agonizing. I checked the Waco news outlets daily, my stomach in knots, waiting for the fallout. Every day that passed with no news felt like a failure, a sign that maybe my evidence had been dismissed or lost in a bureaucratic shuffle. I started to doubt myself, wondering if I had done enough, but my friend Jake was a calming force. These investigations take time, he assured me. They have to move carefully, especially when it involves children. Trust the process. Then one Tuesday morning, it happened. The headline was stark and explosive. Waco family DAYCARE shut DOWN amid shocking abuse allegations. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked the link and the article detailed an ongoing investigation into Thomas and Carol Doyle following an anonymous tip. They had been arrested. I felt a wave of dizzying relief, so intense it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't triumph. It was the profound, quiet release of a burden I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The story became a local firestorm. My anonymous tip had opened the floodgates. Other parents, emboldened by the news, came forward. They shared their own stories of their children's sudden behavioral changes, the unexplained bruises they had tried to reason away, the nightmares that had started plaguing their toddler's sleep. Lisa provided her testimony, and other parents discovered they too had evidence, fragments of conversations overheard or photos of injuries they'd taken out of a vague, unformed suspicion. My package had been the spark, but the parents' collective voice became the inferno. The trial was set for the spring. I was never contacted, never called as a witness. My anonymity had held, but I knew I had to be there. This wasn't about revenge, it was about closure. It was about seeing the final chapter of this dark story written with my own eyes. On the first day of the trial, I drove to Waco and slipped into the back row of the courtroom, a stranger in a place that held all the ghosts of my past. I kept my head down, my face obscured by a baseball cap. Thomas and Carol sat at the defendant's table. My father was rigid, his face a mask of cold defiance, projecting an aura of wronged authority. My mother was a shrunken version of herself, head bowed, hands trembling in her lap. They looked like strangers to me. The emotional ties had been so thoroughly severed that all I felt was a distant, clinical detachment. When the prosecutor began presenting the evidence, the courtroom's hushed whispers fell into a stunned silence. The first exhibit was my video. Projected onto a large screen for the jury to see, the footage played, Carol, her face contorted in a snarl, violently shaking the crying toddler. The child's head snapped back and forth in sickening repetition. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Next, they played the clip of Thomas slapping the little girl, his hand moving with a brutal, practiced efficiency. Then came the audio. They played the file from the recorder in Max's backpack. Thomas's voice, amplified by the courtroom speakers, roared through the silent room. If you don't stop that crying right now, I'm going to lock you in the dark room. I closed my eyes, the words echoing not just in the courtroom, but in the deepest, most wounded parts of my memory. I thought of Ella, so small and so brave, trying to tell me about that very threat. I thought of the child I once was, cowering in a corner, knowing that same fear. When I opened my eyes, I saw that some of the jurors were crying. My father's stoic facade finally cracked. A flicker of something, was it panic, rage, crossed his face before he smoothed it back into a mask of indifference. My mother just wept silently, her shoulders shaking. They didn't stand a chance. The evidence was too damning, the testimonies from other parents too heartbreaking. Their defense attorneys' attempts to frame it as traditional discipline fell apart under the weight of the raw, visual proof of their cruelty. The verdict came swiftly. I sat in the same shadowed corner as the foreperson read it aloud, their voice clear and steady. Thomas Doyle was found guilty on multiple counts of child abuse and endangerment. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10. His rights as a guardian were permanently terminated. Carol Doyle, for her role in enabling and participating in the abuse, received 5 years of probation, including mandatory psychological counseling, and was permanently banned from ever working with children again. There were no cheers, no applause, just a heavy, solemn sill. And set, as they were led away, my father's eyes swept the courtroom, and for a fleeting second they met mine. There was no recognition, no remorse. There was only cold, impotent fury. In that moment I felt nothing for him, not pity, not anger, not sadness. He was simply a man who had made his choices, and now he would live with the consequences. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom before anyone else, melting back into the anonymity of the street. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of gray that matched the mood, but as I took my first deep breath of the cool, damp air, I felt a profound sense of lightness. The cycle was broken. The ghosts of the past had been faced and they had been defeated. It wasn't a victory, it was a liberation. A year can change everything. A year after the trial, the chaotic noise of our past had finally faded into a distant hum. We left Austin behind and moved to a small, quiet town nestled in the hill country. Our new home was modest, but it had a small backyard with a sturdy oak tree, a place I knew Vivian would have loved. This was our fresh start, a place with no memories attached, no shadows lurking in the corners. The move was transformative for the kids. Ella blossomed. Her new school was small and nurturing, and she quickly made friends. Her artwork, which I framed and hung all over the house, was now an explosion of vibrant color, no more dark figures or houses with barred windows. She drew pictures of our new life, me, her, and Luke in our yard with a smiling sun and a brilliant blue sky. She still drew Vivian in our family portraits, a beautiful angel watching over us, and it filled my heart with a bittersweet ache. Luke, now a sturdy toddler, was taking his first wobbly steps across the green grass of our yard. His vocabulary was expanding daily, with dada being his favorite word. His easy laughter was the new soundtrack of our home, a sound so pure and joyful it felt like a daily miracle. The jumpiness and fear were gone, replaced by the boundless curiosity of a happy, healthy little boy. When I held him, he would wrap his chubby arms around my neck, and in those moments, I knew we were truly healing. I quit my high-pressure agency job and transitioned to full-time freelance work. The income was less predictable, but the trade-off was immeasurable. I had time. Time to make pancakes in the morning, time to take the kids to the park in the afternoon, time to read Ella a story before bed without my mind being on a looming deadline. I was present, and I was finally becoming the father they deserved. Becca became a permanent fixture in our new life. She visited almost every weekend, driving down from the city with homemade cookies and a bottomless supply of funny stories. The fractured relationship of our youth was reforged into an unbreakable bond. She was the cool aunt who spoiled Ella with art supplies and taught Luke how to make silly faces. For me, she was my confidant, the one person who truly understood the depth of the scars we both carried. We didn't often talk about our parents anymore. We didn't need to. Our shared silence on the subject was a testament to our shared survival. I continued my therapy sessions with Emily via video call. They were less about crisis management now and more about maintenance, like tending to a garden. I learned to accept that the memories would likely never disappear completely. Sometimes a loud noise or a fleeting image would trigger a flicker of the old fear. But now I had the tools to handle it. I could acknowledge the feeling, name it, and then let it go, refusing to let it take root in the present. One perfect spring afternoon, I was in the backyard watching Ella chase butterflies while Luke sat on a blanket, happily clapping his hands. The sun was warm on my face and the air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass. In that simple, peaceful moment, I was struck by a profound sense of clarity. I used to think justice was about punishment, about making Thomas and Carol pay for what they did, but I was wrong. The verdict, the prison sentence, that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was this. It was Ella's carefree laughter. It was Luke's trusting smile. It was a childhood free from fear, a home built on safety and unconditional love. Justice wasn't about avenging the past, it was about protecting the future. It was about ensuring the cycle of pain that had defined my family for generations ended with me. My journey started in the darkest place imaginable, a place of grief, guilt, and unimaginable betrayal. But it led me here to this moment of quiet grace. I broke the cycle not just for my children, but for the scared little boy I used to be. I gave him the safety he never had. If you're listening to my story and you see a child in pain or a family that seems to be struggling under a dark cloud, please don't turn away. Don't make the mistake I made. Silence is the soil where abuse grows. A sin. Glee voice, a single act of courage, can be the light that exposes the darkness. It can be the spark that saves a child. I spoke up not just for Ella and Luke, but for all the children whose names I'll never know. You can do the same. I walked over to my children and knelt on the grass, pulling them both into a tight hug. Ella giggled and Luke babbled happily, his little hand patting my cheek. As I held them bathed in the warm afternoon light, I felt a final, complete sense of peace settle over me. We were free, we were safe, and we were finally home.